Welcome to the Redefining Sales podcast, where we reimagine and redefine sales in a digital world. In this new series, we have absolutely scoured the world to bring you only the best of the very best. We will be working with each of the thought leaders to unpack all of their years of experience, their pearls of wisdom and nuggets of gold into bite-sized chunks that will enable you to redefine your sales. Welcome to the Redefining Sales podcast. My name is Abby White. This week we have the amazing Dr. Marcele De Sanctis. And Marcele is someone I first saw present about 3 years ago at a conference. And I was just so wowed by her that I've been following some of her journey and her work ever since. And she's someone that I've been dying to have on the podcast to really tap into all things leadership and what that means for sales and marketing. So if you haven't come across Marcele and her work, let me share with you a little bit about her. So Marcele has extensive experience working with global companies, ASX-listed companies, government companies, and she supports boards, CEOs, C-level executives with capability development, competency architecture, leadership assessment, leadership development, executive coaching, talent management, and L&D. You can quickly see why I want to tap into her huge brain. She's a regular keynote speaker and thought leader who's contributed into the likes of Boss Magazine, AFR, Australian Institute of Management, and other publications. And Marcele founded in 2016, CLA, which is the Center for Leadership Advantage. And what CLA do is they provide psychological products and services for leadership, and they take quite an independent and objective approach to it. They have several different amazing people in their team who I've also seen present and speak. And it's just a really phenomenal team of organizational psychologists who are really helping with leadership and with that level of expertise. So their main clients they're working with today are ASX-listed clients, but also private sector clients. So in this conversation, what we're going to be doing is tapping into Marcele's brain around what right now are some of the trends that she's seeing across the board with the leaders that she's working with. It's been a really demanding couple of years. So what right now is being demanded of us? I then tap into, of course, as you would expect, all things sales and marketing. How do you bring together sales and marketing teams and start with that leading from the front? How do you stop the cultural divide, the communication divide, the divide in the definition of success and KPIs, and all those sorts of things? We also talk about building high-performance teams and how we can also retain and develop talent, which is obviously something hugely topical at the moment. So there is so much in this conversation from Dr. Marcele that I'm excited to be sharing with you. So make sure you've got your pad and a pen ready for a lot of pearls of wisdom from Dr. Marcele De Sanctis. Welcome to the Redefining Sales podcast. This week, I am unbelievably excited to have Marcele De Sanctis, which I've just learnt to pronounce. Did I get it right?
Spot on.
Yay! I just had to go into the family history of Marcele's surname just to understand it. So it was actually a good story. Tell us the story quickly, because now everyone needs to know.
The story, yes. So I only found this out reasonably recently. So I always knew that my grandparents had come from Italy as migrants to Australia in the 50s. But apparently many generations ago, the surname actually originates from Spain. And it represents of the saints. De Sanctis is of the saints. So there you go.
So you are our saint of leadership.
Yeah, I love that. I'll go with that.
I'm going to see your website change later on this afternoon.
I know, right? My LinkedIn tagline, everything. This is the beauty of working with a sales leader.
There you go. You got that one for free. So I've invited Marcele on as someone who I saw speak probably about 3 years ago now, pre-COVID in Broome, on a conference. And as soon as I saw you speak, I was just like, oh my gosh, totally fell in love instantly and just loved your work. And I wanted to have you on today in particular to tap into your brain around leadership, to tap into your brain and your passion around developing talent, and really to unpack that and bring your expertise to the sales and marketing world. So thank you so much for joining us. I've been a fan of yours for several years now.
Oh, that is so kind. And the feeling is absolutely mutual. And I think you're right. Whenever we talk about leadership, it obviously applies to a whole range of different functions. And whenever we talk about sales and marketing, we have to talk about leadership too. So they really all fit together very nicely.
Totally agree. So I want to start broad initially and just sort of actually take a look at leadership. It's been a bloody challenging year or 2 years or 3 years, whatever we're up to now, for anyone who's been in a leadership position, with just so much change, so much, managing remote teams, all the emotional side of stuff, which has gone with the challenges of the past couple of years. Yeah. I kind of want to get a baseline of now, moving into 2022, we're all, learning to live with the new normal. Yeah. What's kind of the baseline right now around any trends you're seeing in leadership or top priorities you're seeing with leaders at the moment?
Yeah, I think, and we're sort of in this space, on a daily basis. Without a doubt, talent, the attraction and retention of talent is absolutely first and foremost critical for leaders. And I think that's really across pretty much most industries. Some industries are feeling it a lot harder than others, but that is the ability to find great people, attract them, retain them, and create a working environment for them that actually they'll thrive in and that they'll feel committed to for the long term is really, really important. I think as we've seen through COVID, people are making a lot of career decisions based on health and well-being priorities and really regaining control of their career journey and their pathway and what they want it to look like. And they're thinking about well-being as a key criteria that has to be ticked off. And so that's really making it very challenging to attract and retain people in traditional working roles. So we're seeing a big shift towards what we would call the gig economy and people being retained for their skills and for their services, but very much on interim assignments or project-based working. I think another big challenge facing leaders is really just trying to nail what is our cadence now that we are probably working hybrid or spending some time working from home, but others are wanting to be in the office. What is the cadence that's going to work best for our team to be productive? How many meetings a week do we need to have? What do we need to cover off in those meetings? How do we meet everyone where they're at, because they've got different work preferences and communication styles and different conditions that they want to work in? There's not just one size fits all anymore. And so all those various options, I think, have actually thrown up a lot of challenges for leaders because of the amount of energy and time that is needing to be spent working out what's going to bring the best out of every single one person, because it's often a little bit different.
That is so interesting. And I completely agree. It's, there's so much talk of the great resignation and everyone's putting their own sort of spin on that. But whatever spin you want to put or frame of it you want to put, the reality is so many people are changing roles. Like you said, so many people are moving to new locations and going, well, I don't have to be at the office anymore. I don't have to be in the city anymore. So I'm going to move, and making various lifestyle decisions from that.
Or maybe they're also feeling, exactly as per what you've said, and that they're feeling that, with COVID, things changed so quickly. Things change on a dime. And so they may be thinking as well, things can change quickly in the other direction. So why continue at something if I'm not enjoying it, or I actually want to give something else a go? I think that's, people are thinking a lot more in the here and now, perhaps. Because we saw how quickly COVID changed everything around us. And, I think leaders, it's not just about getting to know the different personality styles in your team anymore. It's actually about those styles, how people want to work, what their family situation is like that's going to allow them to work in different ways, shapes and forms. So it's just a lot more kind of intel that you need to have, I think, to optimize that working environment and those team relationships. And then just lastly, some of the other, I guess, challenges, opportunities and top of mind themes for leaders are things like diversity and inclusion, creating environments of equity and equality, being able to really think about community impact. ESG is becoming a really important priority for leaders to start to have a point of view on as well. So a lot's being asked.
Yeah. And it's very demanding, and a lot of it's quite heavy. It's quite heavy stuff.
Yeah, so I don't think it's enough to just be a technical expert anymore. You actually have to have a position and a point of view on these emerging workplace trends and expectations. And it's about being well-read, being well-researched, not being an expert, but knowing when to bring in an expert because it's really important. Being able to really respect people's values and belief systems, and acknowledge those in a really inclusive way. Critically important to create a great working environment.
Yeah. And in some respects, it's sort of working harder for that when you're all remote and making sure everyone does feel included and the communication stays top of mind.
Yeah, exactly right. That's exactly right.
So I want to delve down a layer and sort of go more specifically to sales and marketing. Obviously, as you know, sales and marketing is our game. And one thing that we've really observed is that when we're working with organizations and we're encouraging them to think smarketing and bring the two together and not have that sort of separation, we're noticing that the projects where we see the most success are where we've got great buy-in from a country manager or a general manager, and it really does start from the top, and it sort of really does filter down. So that's an observation our side. I'd be curious to get your take on that. But what we're finding is therefore how at a senior leadership level do you drive collaboration across departments? Because whilst our game is sales and marketing, everyone has the same thing, whether it's between finance and operations or something else. So I'd love to get your expertise around driving that collaboration across different departments.
Yeah, so there's a really great construct that we work with a lot with our various clients, and it's called enterprise leadership. And it actually was a construct that was proposed probably a few years ago now by a global research and consulting organization. And they really started to see that truly more productive and culturally aligned organizations and teams started to embrace a mindset that was reflective of, yes, this is what I have to achieve individually. This is what my KPIs are as an individual, or this is what my team's KPIs are. But actually, if I look up and look across and I think about what are the goals of our entire network or our entire organization, and I take an interest in those things and really align our work activities with the broader enterprise, we can actually be much more successful. And so this kind of concept of enterprise leadership emerged as a way of leading, as a mindset shift. It's not just a role, it's actually a way of leading. And some of the behaviours associated with enterprise leadership or an enterprise way of thinking are things like recognizing, yes, what we have to achieve individually and as a team, but what are the shared KPIs that we can create, and what can we be stronger together in achieving? It's being able to advocate for your team in a meeting, but be comfortable if the decision is made, it doesn't benefit you completely, but it actually benefits the greater good, and walk away from that and fully endorse that decision, because ultimately that's an enterprise way of thinking. It's being able to take a real interest in the activities and the work of other business units and other teams. It's being able to forego a project that you want investment in one area, because you actually are become aware that if you were to work collaboratively with another function on a bigger project, you actually have a better chance of benefiting for your whole team. So it's just kind of starting to think about putting self-interest aside and what is truly best for the entire organization. And if we can start to think that way, there's really good emerging research that's starting to suggest practically that organizations can actually unlock a hell of a lot more productivity and opportunities by adopting that kind of way of thinking.
Oh, you have got me so excited. This is
right. It's a really good one.
And so
so you sort of think structurally about how organizations need to be set up in that way, from a systems perspective, from a KPI perspective, from a mindset perspective, is sort of a way of kind of embedding that way of thinking.
So I've got a couple of questions off the back of this. So start with mindset, right? Because it's a behavioral change, it's a mindset change with the team. What's the first step to kickstart that? Because it could be a really interesting time of year to think about this, because we're coming up to a lot of FY23 kickoffs where people are getting their teams together and there's opportunity to create, okay, cool, we're going into FY23. This is how we're setting ourselves up for this year. So can you start with the mindset piece for me of what would be a first step, for example, to encourage your team to think like that?
Yeah, so we've been doing quite a lot of work with executive teams who are going through planning processes. And often the first step is actually through psychometric assessment or through kind of one-on-one discovery conversations, understanding the degree to which the individual is naturally inclined to think that way, or are there work preferences and personality preferences that are getting in the way. And then having sessions with the executive to start to unpack, well, what are the tension points? What are the strengths in how we work together? And where can an enterprise mindset start to shift the dial on those things? And what are our ways of working as a team that we can optimize by thinking differently? And what's getting in the way of us thinking differently? Is it a personality preference, the way that I see the world that could be a little bit more in an enterprise lens? Or is it actually that people are thinking that way, but there are systemic challenges or barriers that are in the way of us operating that way as a team? So that's kind of starting with the individual and moving it into that kind of group-wide conversation.
I love that. And the second thing I want to pick up on is you mentioned there around KPIs, and that sort of caught my attention, because it's something that's interesting for us in our sales and marketing world, is that typically the KPIs are totally different. And so the definition of success for marketing might be that we got engagement, or that we got a marketing qualified lead. So it might be that I attended a webinar. Sales look at that and go, you're kidding me, right? A qualified lead is someone who they've got budget. We're talking to them actively about a project. So you're working to slightly different KPIs because you're both playing a different role. But it then creates a disconnect on what is success and what does success look like, because we're almost to some degree running different races.
Yes.
So how do you bring together the piece around KPIs and a shared understanding for success?
Yeah, and you're spot on. It's really difficult, and those tension points very much exist. And I even sort of think about my own experiences and exposures. I've often thought of sales and marketing being very different skill sets, different profiles, and different leaders that best fit those roles. And so naturally kind of separating them. But you're right, there is an expectation that actually a lot more can be achieved by thinking of them together and thinking of them as aligned. I think bringing it back to what are the higher order goals, what's the higher order purpose of the organization and what we're striving to achieve. Bringing it to what is it that we need to achieve together across these two functions, that there has to be some shared goal or shared KPI that we can both buy into. It's a matter of kind of distilling, well, what exactly is that metric? And then what are the things that do need to be treated separately, but we're okay to treat them separately because ultimately the shared goal is the more important one, or there's more of our KPI that is linked to that shared piece. So I think it's about kind of unpacking what are the sets of metrics, but then what can we be aligned on, or what can we actually be rewarded collectively on? And then kind of cross-check that the organisation is ready for that, and that culturally the organisation's ready for that. If I think about creating shared value across those two functions, ultimately I think it's about, well, what's best for the customer? What is best for the user experience? Who are we ultimately serving? And if we can agree that we've got that in common, maybe there's an alignment there around shared goals and shared KPIs with that in mind. But it is challenging, and I think there's still a lot more education around the fact that the functions are complementary and better together before we can start to really think about what that looks like from a KPI perspective. And, you know, so the work that you're doing in that education piece is so important to flick the switch on people's existing frames of reference and how they've seen the world previously to this point.
Oh, you've hit on so many things there that I think are interesting. One that I want to tap into immediately on that is you mentioned there around culture. And I think that's really interesting because I think that's part of the foundation. You know, historically, I was on the sales side, and there's typically not a lot of love lost between a lot of sales and marketing departments. Now, this is a mass generalization.
Yeah.
And, you know, one of my team always jokes that, you know, she worked somewhere and the salespeople used to refer to marketing as the colouring in department. And then likewise, most people think that the salespeople are just out on the beers the whole time and at the pub.
Doing the deals.
Doing the deals at the pub. I did learn to sell in London, so, you know, guilty. But I've been, and what's interesting for me now is I see both sides of that fence, right? And you see both of the stigmas there. And so sometimes the culture, we find as soon as we start working with an organization, you notice that, and that we describe it, it's almost like a divorced couple that don't like each other. And we're almost like the marriage counselor trying to bring it together. So how do you start with that cultural piece? Because I almost feel like you can't do some of that shared understanding and shared KPI when there's still that cultural divorced
100%.
couple.
Yeah, 100% agree. So I think, you know, typically, I think a logical flow in terms of driving that culture change starts with that good old positioning of the future state, what it is that we want to get to, and then being able to talk about, well, where are we at currently? What are the barriers? What are the challenges that's getting in the way? And openly conversing around, well, what's in it for me? What's in it for each of the key stakeholders coming to the table? And then looking at how we can start to bring things together in a way that satisfies everybody or lets everyone feel like they've had a win. I think culture change is always really, really difficult because we're trying to shift deeply embedded ways of thinking, values and belief systems. People have come to an environment with very different frames of reference. So what they think is sophisticated marketing is in one previous organisation might be very different to what it's defined like in a current organisation. So we've got to be really respectful of all the places that people are coming from, I guess, in having that culture conversation. I think education is a critical one. Sharing case studies, sharing examples of when the two together have been much more powerful, when there's been new opportunities unlocked because marketing's brought something to the table that sales couldn't, and vice versa. Recognising respective strengths and recognising how, whilst the tension points exist, they actually can help us to craft a better solution because we need both to be successful. I think that's showing people how it's been done previously when those two have come together. I think really like culture change 101 is showing how it's been done before and therefore using that as the sales tactic for why people need to get on board with that change. I think also it's educating workforces on the expectation that things are changing and you actually need to have a perspective on marketing if you're a sales leader, and that if you're a marketing leader, you need to have a perspective on sales. You actually can't have one without the other. And if there's an expectation that you need to be reasonably well versed in both, yes, you might have technical strengths in one as opposed to the other, but you still need to have a point of view. And organizations must have a point of view on content, thought leadership, a presence online, be thinking strategically about events, because they then flow into the sales opportunities. So I think it's just being really tactical and intentional about how the activities are more integrated than how perhaps they've been defined before.
Yeah, I love that. And what's really interesting about that is I believe that the requirements are changing. So, for example, as a sales professional 5 years ago, you could say, well, marketing are responsible for LinkedIn and they're responsible for social media. Now you look at, 96% of the content we consume is by individuals, and actually the salespeople sharing on their LinkedIn or their social channels have a huge part of the process to share, provide thought leadership, and generate leads through that avenue, and educating the target market and so on. But it's a shift, right? Because for some people, that's a real change. And we're not suggesting you Instagram your breakfast. That's not what I'm saying. Or, your kids, you don't have to do that. You live in Melbourne, so maybe you do Instagram your breakfast and your coffee because you guys have such cool cafes.
But I definitely don't. Not with the two little kids at home. We're very simple meals. So they're not Instagrammable at all.
That's true. I forgot you got two very young ones. But it does require a change, right? So if you are sitting there going, well, I've always been successful at sales because I've done it this way, and then suddenly you're being asked to do something different that's outside of your comfort zone. Likewise with marketing, it's massively changed with digital over the past couple of years. So again, you're being required to change. So most people are nervous around change. So talk to us about that a little bit, around managing when the role's evolving, technology's changing. I know the other night I was having a conversation with my brother about the metaverse, and both of us came away from the conversation going, shit, we're old. And my brother said, this is what our mum and dad must feel like. So talk to us about change and managing change.
Well, I mean, so, change, managing change, I think it goes without saying, change is a constant. It's something that the new normal is change and doing things differently, and people needing to be comfortable that is the way forward. We, again, do a lot of work in the change space. And if I think about some of the kind of lessons I've learned in leading those programs, and even leading those programs within our own organisation through a lot of change that we've been through as a consulting firm, it's the little things that matter. Employees and people, whilst leaders might be thinking strategy and big picture and the next 5-year plan and the next big event and the next big transformation, it's very easy to be disconnected from the day-to-day working rhythm and practices and routines that, when they change, the majority of the workforce really feel them. Changes to systems, how we access data. So my big takeaway around managing change is, don't just get so hooked into the big picture, the transformation and all the fabulous opportunities that come with that. Really connect at the grassroots and do the little things well. Get the day-to-day systems right. Get the communication messages out there far more frequently than what you think you need, because people will often not hear the message the way that you intended the first time. It takes multiple iterations for the penny to drop and for them to feel comfortable and to have truly heard it. And be as transparent as you can be, because yes, while there's obviously confidential things, there are changes, there are things that can't be disclosed at various points in the journey. Ring fence those and be transparent on everything else, because people want to hear the journey and feels a lot of security in hearing that journey. And if I again think about my own experience leading change, my style is to be really transparent. And whilst it may actually have the effect that people feel like they're riding the roller coaster a little bit, they certainly know where they stand. And I then create the kind of advocacy around, these are all the great things that are going to happen and be experienced as a result of you coming on that journey. These are the experiences that you'll get that you didn't get before. So there are loads of models of change out there and processes to follow from a change perspective, but they're just some really practical front of mind things that I have as my kind of top lessons, and things to reflect on in that change process.
It's so interesting you say the little things. I'm ex-IBM, and I always remember when IBM used to acquire all the time all these businesses.
Yeah.
One of the biggest culture shocks and challenges people had was there's no free biscuits. And the uproar about no free tea and coffee and no free biscuits was always absolutely phenomenal. So it wasn't about the big stuff, it was the tea and biscuits.
Yep, spot on. It's the little things that matter. It really, really is. And those things, they're symbolic, aren't they? They're symbolic of, hang on, am I going to be able to have that comfort there while everything else around me is changing?
Yeah. And car parking spaces.
And simple things like, how do I access IT now? Is there someone physically who can support? I mean, all those things are really, really important. And I think it's changing the expectations that leaders have of new employees and how ready they are for change and how resilient they are and how adaptable they are. We're looking for different things now because change is a constant.
Yeah.
And that whole, piece around soft skills or non-technical skills, I should say, being so important to how we work and to the successful employee profile, is only becoming more important for what we hire for.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more with that. Before we go there, actually, because I want to come back to that in a minute, but before we go there, you mentioned on that piece around communication and being transparent. And I find that really interesting because, again, coming back to our sort of sales and marketing piece, what I find really interesting is the research shows that only 1/3 of sales and marketing teams communicate regularly, only 1/3. And 9 out of 10 sales and marketing professionals don't believe they're on the same page in terms of strategy, KPIs, alignment, all the things we talked about. So communication there, it's obviously critical to everything you've talked about thus far. How do you keep communication going and how do you keep that transparency when we are now in this hybrid world where we're not all, in the office and gathering around for lunch, or we're not all, maybe having that team meeting all in the same place? So how do you amplify the communication and do that in a little hybrid world?
Yeah, so a couple of things that I'm kind of seeing and hearing and observing just in the last few months in particular. I think it goes without saying that the basis of effective communication is being able to have a psychologically safe environment where people feel like their voice has been heard. So without a doubt, the cornerstone of an effective communicative environment is people feeling psychologically safe. They feel like their voice has been heard. They've had the opportunity to contribute. They feel like if they make a mistake or say something that they think is, embarrassing or wrong, it's not going to be just shut off. That they, have valid questions to ask. So I think the key of effective communication is ensuring that the climate is one that actually draws out what it is that they want to communicate. And that's really the role of the leader, to be able to create that environment and the people within it. And so to be able to do little pulse checks with the team, to be able to check in one-on-one and make sure that people are feeling like they're contributing and adding value as per what they're intending to contribute. And if they're not, or they're missing that opportunity, then understanding why and what we can do differently and how we get together. The other thing I'm observing is that the leader, and again, a lot of stuff sits on the leader, but the leader is really required to, I think, host and facilitate much more effectively than ever before. So the ability to run an online meeting, to draw people in, to set a clear agenda, to connect the dots between what people are saying, to bring it all together, to ask good questions, I think is a skill that is rapidly being required faster than ever before, because it wasn't something that naturally came to a lot of leaders because they didn't really have to do it as much when they were in a different working environment, and communication was a lot more opportunistic. So I think that is critically important. There's sort of some of the things that spring to mind around that. Learning how to host, learning how to facilitate as a skill set, inviting contribution, and even looking at, well, what does true inclusive leadership mean? Because if I can create an inclusive environment free of bias, where people feel that they can show up exactly as their authentic self, that's going to be a critical prerequisite to be able to draw out communication and to invite contribution, I think.
It's so interesting. And even going back to your previous point around the basics, I'm finding some of that myself, is the basics. We just had all of our team together last week, and we had 5 of us in the room and we had 3 of us online in other locations. And where we were working, because we chose an offsite location, even though it was a co-working space and the internet should have been great, the internet was diabolical. And so 3 people were struggling to contribute to the conversation, or their answers would be seriously lagging, and then got to a point where they were like, oh God. And so you kind of go, oh my gosh, even the fact that you're having to run a hybrid meeting in somewhere you think would be fine to facilitate that effectively, it's not. And then you're left with 3 people in your team just purely frustrated and not really able to contribute. So it's even those
That's
little
right. Yep. So, what are the working meetings? I think a really important thing is really deciphering what are the formal working meetings, forums of communication that are actually non-negotiable. We actually do need to be together, or the majority of us need to be together for it. Or if we can't be together, reschedule it, or make sure that there's a support mechanism in place whereby someone's taking really good minutes and then schedules a time to debrief one-on-one with the people that weren't able to be there or had sort of shonky connections, to make sure that they feel as involved as possible and have had ample opportunity to contribute. And then what are the forums, the more informal communication channels or meetings where actually we don't need everybody there? Let's allocate a couple of representatives, because it's actually more productive that way, and we can get still what we need to get done, but again, enable that mechanism of sharing information. And this is kind of getting creative about things like that. Not easy. And even doing, a quick 30-second check-in at the end of a meeting. How did everyone feel that went? How did it go? Did it go well? Were there challenges? What could we have done differently? Who felt like they weren't heard? Being able to kind of audit in real time, I think is really critical to actually just get comfortable with giving that kind of feedback to each other too.
Yeah, that's so interesting. Taken several notes on that one.
Oh,
after our team meeting fail last week.
Yeah.
I want to change tact a little bit and sort of go back to some previous points we touched on. One thing that we're seeing start to emerge at the moment, which is huge, is companies like Unilever have announced that we're no longer having a CMO. We're actually going to...
I saw that.
Huge. We're actually going to merge responsibility for marketing, but also e-commerce and the digital part of the sales process, and not all of it, but the digital piece, end to end under one roof. And the likes of Uber and a couple other businesses have done the same. So that's massive. I've got a meeting booked in my diary today with someone who's a director of sales and marketing. And I went, because it's quite unusual, but more companies are starting to think about it. Now, for any business who's thinking about it, obviously this is a beast of a thing, because it's responsibility change, it's structural change, it's all the things we've talked about. So if anyone is starting to they've seen it in the news, they're starting to toy with it. What would be some of your recommendations to start to think about? Because it's a beast of a question. So what would be some of your starting points on that?
So I mean, I think, well, first of all, it's definitely organizational design and change management and subsequently culture program of work. So it's not just a technical delineation or bringing together of different functions and a kind of reorganization of those functions. That sits within a whole transformation program of work, really. And so what are some of the key principles that underpin that transformation for people that might be thinking about it? I mean, from my end, it's certainly getting clarity on, what is the ultimate goal that we're trying to achieve by bringing these functions together. If we think about the Unilever example, their mind straight away went to the customer experience, the way customers are buying, the way customers are engaging online became quite blurred in terms of the lines between marketing and sales, or e-commerce, digital and marketing. And so because of that blurring, there was an immediate opportunity that I think they saw by saying, well, customers are thinking in this way and operating in this way, and you probably did a whole lot of research to validate and confirm that. So therefore, we need to reorganize ourselves structurally, internally, in a different way to be able to meet customers where they're at and with how their buying behavior is evolving. So you often start with the goal, the future state, and what it is that you're trying to achieve, and nut that out, and then create the structure that's going to be optimal as a result, and then find the great people for that structure. But you've got to retain some fluidity in the structure so that as you come across great talent in the market or things need to change, you can kind of shift and evolve it, and it can still be somewhat flexible, even though it's serving that purpose. There does need to be some sort of permanence to it. So that's, I mean, they're kind of at a very high level, the thinking that goes into kind of structure change. If I think about the work that, again, we do in that space, it's really around, there's clearly tension points that have been brought to the table as to why something's not working. So there might be, excessive operating expenses because we're structured a particular way. There might be culture or engagement challenges because it's too siloed and functions aren't talking to each other properly, or they're not working together in a way that best services the market. And so it requires this reorganization to be a lot more effective and productive, and to actually unlock opportunity to drive savings. So I'm sure Unilever would have had financial reasons, cultural reasons, and first and foremost, customer reasons that would have driven this particular change.
I love that in so many of your answers, you've drawn it to the customer, because I know myself from working in, various different businesses, either with our clients or working in previous corporates, sometimes, as much as we all know that, sometimes it gets a little bit lost, and the customer voice gets a little bit lost. So I love that you've referenced that, because absolutely there's so much research to show the sort of change towards, even from a B2B perspective, not just B2C, 80% of sales is going to be digital within the next 3 years. So it's that transformation that's happening from a customer side. How do you then embrace that and reflect that in the organization? It's a big question.
Yeah, it really is. Yeah. So, and it kind of comes, look, I find that everything in this world of leadership and the sort of stuff that we're talking about is often connected, because what we're talking about is customer experience, the way that people shop from our shop, making it easy for people to do business with us. That's also one of my key principles. But it actually wraps up into the broader conversation around purpose. Who are we ultimately here to serve? What are we ultimately here to do? It's not just to return to shareholders, because that way of thinking has kind of been and gone. There's an expectation that really large organizations are giving back. They've got a position on sustainability. They've got a firm footprint in the community. They're helping their customers. I mean, you look at ANZ, who have just now started to talk a lot more about financial well-being, that they see their role as very much being about driving the well-being of their community. That's a pretty big obligation, or a statement to make, that it's not just about providing products and services for them to make choices. It's actually about providing you with a well solution, or enabling you to be well in the financial decisions that you're making. So I think, so that kind of extension of responsibility and of why the organisation exists is changing a lot.
I've noticed that a huge amount. I'd say 10 years ago, and this is just my personal opinion, 10 years ago, got no research to back it up, but I'd say 10 years ago, it was very much a tick in the box. So when we were doing tenders, when we were doing RFPs, what's your stance on corporate social responsibility? Yep, tick, great, done. Whereas now it is so real in terms of why employees want to work with you, why customers want to work with you. And it's a huge part of the journey. And I'd say we are really noticing that right now.
Yeah, couldn't agree more. It's absolutely critical. And likewise, in terms of what's expected when we are pitching for work or putting an initiative forward or designing something, we've really got to be thinking about not just the kind of learning or leadership experience. It goes very much beyond that.
Yeah, I love that. So I want to sort of do a couple quick fire questions before we let you go. The next one is sort of coming back to your starting point. You talked at the moment around, what's the baseline? What are some of the trends around actually how are we retaining talent? How do we upskill our talent and so on? What do we love talking about high performance cultures and high performance teams. So what right now are you encouraging leaders to do to keep and protect that talent and invest in their teams and upskill?
Yeah, so certainly when we are talking with leaders about their role and where they're spending their time, we're encouraging them to think about spending time across how they lead themselves, how they lead others, how they lead across the organisation, and then how they are leading in the community. So having that kind of model is helpful to then think, okay, how much time am I dedicating to each of these? And there are key kind of skill sets that are associated with each of those lenses that you can think about in terms of leadership. D&I, diversity and inclusion, being able to be really intentional in creating inclusive working environments is, I think, without a doubt, one of the most important things that leaders can do. Get well read on some of the thought leadership and some of the research around D&I. Start to kind of read topical pieces around what are organisations needing to focus on in that space. What are they doing in that space to lead more effectively? And in line with that, start to have a point of view on sustainability and what it looks like for us to create sustainable organisations. I think another observation that I'd make is we talk a lot about this kind of notion of servant leadership, which is a theoretical construct that was first published many years ago. And there's a book written by a gentleman, Robert Greenleaf, I think is his name, who talks about servant leadership. It's this idea that leaders are really custodians of an organisation or a remit or a team for a period of time. Even if they're founders, they come in, they're serving and leading that organisation and that team, and ultimately want to build it to be better, that when they leave, it can go on and take new growth or a new path under somebody else's leadership. So what we're also spending time doing is recognising that we're here to serve as leaders and to not get protective over patches and to be able to collaborate and to have that enterprise mindset, as opposed to coming from a place of protection and defence, which actually, I think creates tension and barriers for all the things that we've been talking about that we want to see more of in organisations. So that's just a little bit of a kind of flavour of some of the themes that we talk to leaders about and some of the mindset shifts that we help to embed through the work that we're doing.
Yeah, I love that. And you mentioned there, topic close to my heart, reading. You gave us a book reference there. Any other books that we should be getting our hands on, or any other reading recommendations for us?
So look, I must admit, I'm a big fan of just reading the Fin Review every day if I can. I just think there's always such good content and tidbits of information, and actually just really good. I mean, I'm no economist god, but just kind of macro trends and what's happening in the world that actually really affect budget spend and leadership spend and the way that organisations need to connect with their audience and with their community. So I find I certainly gloss over the technical stuff, but I do love that as a good read, just to get a sense of what's going on and what deals are happening, what organisations are being acquired, what's happening in the tech space. What are the kind of industries that are doing interesting things that have been well established in our history for so long, mining and resources. I just think they're so important to kind of keep tabs on. So that's certainly my go-to. There's a book that I read actually probably a couple of years ago now, called Talk Like TED. And it was all about how to give a great TED talk. And whilst that's not happening for me anytime soon, the principles around how to construct a really good presentation and a really good argument and to logically walk an audience through a narrative, I thought was so compelling. And I think that kind of structure can be really helpful for all leaders to latch onto in how they communicate and need to communicate every day.
I've seen that and I haven't bought it, so I've just noted that one down on my list.
Yeah, it's a good one. Yeah.
Marcel, thank you so much. I could talk to you for hours, but thank you so much for sharing so many pearls of wisdom. If people want to connect with you, we'll obviously put your links in the show notes so people can access you there. Anywhere in particular to find you other than Melbourne cafes?
You can find me on LinkedIn. So Dr Marcele De Sanctis on LinkedIn, and I'm the managing partner of CLA. And so we have our Centre for Leadership Advantage website as well.
Thank you so much.
Pleasure. Thank you.